Welcome everyone to Becket Art Center. I'm Jen Beatty. I'm the executive director here. And I do want to just do a little housekeeping. If you could please silence your cell phones. I think most people are really good at that now, but boy, every once in a while. So I'm really happy to welcome you all to our special artist panel tonight. It is part of our Berkshire Pride exhibit downstairs. It features 13 artists and their work, so if you haven't checked it out yet, please check that out. I have a little thing I'd just like to read just because I thought it was very sweet. So, here in the heart of Becket, where creativity flourishes and community thrives, we're proud to host this evening, dedicated to celebrating the vibrant contributions and unique perspectives of LGBTQ+ artists. The arts have always been a powerful medium for expression, understanding, and connection. Tonight, we gather to explore how these incredible artists harness their voices, experiences, and identities to create compelling and impactful work. So thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Bart Church.
So I'm Bart Church. I'm the executive director of QMOB, and we're one of the partner organizations for this exhibit. And I called Jen, I think it was in February, and said, Jen, I want to do a Berkshire LGBT queer art exhibit. Would you all consider doing that? Within 4 minutes, she said, yes, we will do that. That is a brilliant idea. And that's been my whole experience of organizing this, is people say yes. We've got a TV station that said they want to interview queer artists. We've had foundations, Berkshire County Community Foundation gave us a grant. The Becket Cultural Council gave us a grant. We've had a lot of support. As far as we know, this is the first time there is an LGBT art exhibit in the Berkshires. That doesn't mean that there haven't been really important queer artists who made the Berkshires, because there have. Every single major arts organization that I know of in the county that I've worked with has queer artists who've either helped found that institution or made it popular or continue to sustain it. So queer artists have been at the core of the queer art scene and of the art scene in the Berkshires for at least 200 years. Leonard Bernstein, I mean, the list is very, very long of the artists who made the Berkshires what it is. And so this is our way of saying queer artists have always been woven into the community, and they're also your ordinary artists, the ones that exhibit at our farmers markets, in people's homes, the coffee mugs that people drink out of. Those artists are the ones we wanted to showcase in this exhibit. And I'm so incredibly proud of our artists, and I'm excited to hear from them about their journey of becoming an artist and being a queer artist, and whether that affects their art or not, because sometimes it doesn't. And I think the last thing I'll say is thank you for showing up. This wouldn't be a dialogue without you. And so we're going to probably get people straggling in, and we're going to honor them and let them join whenever they do. But yeah, thanks everybody for being part of this celebration of our local queer artists. Thank you.
Hello everyone. My name is Jason Vabori. I'm a former member of the board of QMOB, but still work closely with them. And I've been involved with organizing with the queer community since I was about 17 in the Berkshires, so it's been nearly 30 years now. I'm also the collections manager at the Berkshire Museum, so it was kind of natural that I got pulled into this. Bart sort of pulled me into this whole thing, actually. And I'm delighted to be here with our panelists. And so I'm going to introduce each of them and ask them a question at the same time, and then we're going to get a little bit more organic in our approach. So to start off with, let's see, Rachel. This is Rachel Kaufmann.
Yep.
Hi Rachel. What and who inspires you?
So some artists who inspire me, I mean, the first artist's name comes to mind as a queer artist, Nicole Eisenman. so I spent a lot of time looking at her work, and she does sort of large-scale depictions of queer scenes, or often like riffs on art history that are made sort of contemporary and vented as more queer. I'm inspired by Dana Schutz also, who does kind of like dystopia world, large oil paintings. I think in terms of my own work, I have been working a lot from photographs lately, which I might change, but I normally just kind of will take a lot of photographs of things around me that are part of my experience, and then kind of go back and look through them and take sketches in my sketchbook to sort of find what like visually excites me, and it could even be like a moment of how something is reflected, or a shadow that appears in a certain place, and it kind of tells me whether it's an image worth depicting into a painting.
Thank you, Rachel. You actually just introduced an answer to a question I forgot to ask, which is what is your medium, or your chosen medium to work with? So I'm going to keep moving along in a line here. So next up we have Mitchell Sellers. Mitchell, what is your preferred medium?
So I'm a quilt artist, and other textiles as well, but making quilts is primarily what I do. Is the quick answer.
Yeah. Well, who and what inspires you?
So originally I was inspired growing up at Grandma's knee. You know, she says, put the pretty pieces of fabric, the pretty sides together, and sew it on this side. So that was my original inspiration for eventually growing into being a quilt artist. The gals or ladies or women of G Bend, Alabama, which you may have seen the documentary of. Quilts are primarily came about for utilitarian needs. They would take scraps of whatever to make something comfortable to sleep with, and would put things together beautifully to make pieces of art. But as my art evolved, like Rachel, taking photos, transferring that into a quilt, a lot of the I guess early gay erotica, if you will, Tom of Finland, and even before that, the 20s and 30s, the quiet commercial art that was maybe in military posters for I Want You, handsome men recruiting, were kind of erotic, and those have started to inspire some of my work as well.
Thank you. Let's see, next up we have Chris Pierce. Chris, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Great. I'm an oil painter. I'm a traditional oil painter. I also draw, and I also do pastels and a rare moment watercolors. When I was growing up, I've been painting since I was 6. My mom was an Sunday afternoon painter. When I was in high school, though, I was very fortunate to be able to take art every single day, and I discovered this guy named Paul Cadmus, and I saw these kind of erotic, my God, really, and anyway, so one thing led to another, and I became a professional artist, and very early in my career, I became a member of the Salmagundi Club in New York in 1992, and they were honoring that year Paul Cadmus as their Artist of the Year, and I said, oh my God, he was 90 at the time, and I arrived as a black tie event, and I was wearing a crimson bow tie, and I had to get there early for a reason, because I'd actually dropped off my husband at NYU, who was getting his bachelor, his PhD then. Anyway, I walked into the members' room. Nobody else was there, but there were like 3 guys standing in the end, and one of them was Richard Pionk, the president of the club. And he said, "Hi, Chris." He says, and he stepped back. He said, "Chris, I'd like you to meet Paul Cadmus." And oh my God, the first thing I noticed, he was also wearing a bow tie that was the same color as mine. But he reached out his hand. His gaze went right into my heart. And he was a handsome man. He had a full head of white hair pulled back into a bony tail, just like that. And these magnificent, piercing blue eyes. And he said, "Hello." He said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Well, I'm Chris Pierce. I'm from actually very near Vermont." And he says, "I used to live in Vermont." He says, "Actually, I lived there long enough to get a license, and I still own it because they listed me as being 10 feet 5 inches tall instead of 5 feet 10 inches tall." And then we talked for an hour and a half before the dinner that was for him, and the president of the Art Students League, the president of the National Art League was there. It was extraordinary, and we started with an epistolary relationship. We wrote back and forth, and we actually became friends for 4 years. And I was there on his 95th birthday. 2 weeks before it was the public one, and then he died 1 week after that birthday. Anyway, that was my who I was inspired by.
Thank you. Because next up we have Johanna Merfeld. Johanna, so first off, what is your preferred medium?
So I'm a mixed media artist. I work primarily in large-scale oil, acrylic paintings. I did oil in college, but I also do a lot of collage, printmaking, and I am inspired by a lot of things. So I minored in art history in college, and I'm really inspired by the Fauvist movement, which is like the wild beasts, so really high-key color, sort of abstracted human figures, distorted limbs. The Surrealist movement, so taking inspiration from psychotherapy, dream work, and German Expressionist artists, as well as the Dada movement and collage. And then contemporary artists, I really love Christina Quarles, who is sort of like a contemporary Fauvist artist, and Mickalene Thomas, two of my favorite contemporaries.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So the next question, I'm just going to open up to the group, and you can take turns answering. And I think a couple of you actually have already touched on this, but I'll ask it anyways. Have you been inspired by any other queer artists?
I've been inspired by John Singer Sargent too. That's just okay. And Henry Scott too, who's gay and the contemporary of Sargent.
Mm-hmm. Both of the artists that I mentioned consider themselves queer, and when this question was proposed to us, I also took it to mean artists in not just visual art, but music and poetry, and so I'm always inspired by and listen to queer musicians, and that's always been sort of a backdrop to my art making.
Yeah.
I talked a little bit, about Nicole Eisenman, who's a lesbian and gender fluid. I think she uses she, they pronouns, which is kind of like a way of redefining what's female, and just the depictions of different queer people, gender ambiguous, sexually ambiguous in her work. It was also interesting to listen to their sort of like coming out journey, and talking about how like when they were at RISD, they were out in their personal life, but they weren't out in their artwork, and that sort of led me to sort of think like, what does it mean to be out in the work? And now, often there are even like more intimate scenes depicted in their work, between them and lovers, or other people and lovers, and that's really kind of like tender and interesting as well.
A lot of the stuff that I do is just, again, put the pretty sides together, make it look nice. But truly, when I look at ad work, I mean, stuff that's totally commercial, that the artist that took that photo or, drafted that graphic piece of art, and it's titillating, that inspires me, and I take that and somehow change it to fabric. That's where I guess I don't, and yeah, there was Aunt Clara. You know, she never married.
Did she have a roommate?
She had a roommate. And she was my favorite, too, of all the aunts, because she was the only one that could cross her legs and keep her shins together. And so that was...
I think they were also called Boston marriages. If someone didn't, yes, absolutely. I think it's very important what Johanna said about being inspired also by some queer people who were not necessarily artists. The way you said, I've been inspired by Radcliffe Hall, who wrote The Well of Loneliness, because my grandmother, who raised me, read it when she was like 28, and she was telling me about it. And I just think that we get our inspiration. We can't always pinpoint it, and I think it's very fluid, and it comes through us, and we manifest it sometimes when we're unaware.
I'm going to skip around the questions a little bit because you're making me think. So one of the questions one of you proposed actually that I thought was really interesting, which is what do you feel is the difference between being a queer artist or queer artists and queer art?
I don't want to be the first. Go ahead, somebody go first. Okay, a queer artist is what you do, right? What you do, right? And then a queer art shows what you do. You do it, and then whatever's on canvas is what the queer artist does, or the cause. Somebody else, please.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, but I think for me, I think you're sort of getting at the idea of am I queer and I'm making art, or am I infusing my art with those elements of not just my sexuality, but for me, queerness is somewhat of a political designation, right? And it's interrogating capitalism and heteronormativity and cis-normativity and all of these structures that we have in place in society. And so for me, infusing that political lens into my art makes it more very queer.
Nice.
Thank you for that. Because I'm the one that said, let's talk about this a little bit. Because I just hate labels. But, I'm as proud a queer artist as I can be. At the same time, does that mean what I make is queer art? I don't think so, because one of the pieces I made had references to lynching and KKK shrouds. So that is not at all queer art in my mind. So it's hard for me to just label myself queer artist and all of the stuff that I make as queer art. I think we're artists and we make stuff that's pretty.
Yeah, I think as a queer artist, my art could address multiple parts of my experience, and some of that might have to do with what I consider to be my queerness or the queerness of others, and some of it might have to do with parts of myself that are unrelated, or some of my queer art might have to do with queerness, and then also just parts of the human condition, because we're all just kind of humans experiencing, and some of those queer experiences are also just human experiences.
And if you just use the colors that are in the pride flag, but you're a straight person, have you made queer art?
Good question.
Wow. I wonder, before we had these defining labels, there's an extraordinary show that's in Chicago right now at the Wrightwood 659 Gallery. It's called The First Homosexuals. And it's called that because in 1868, the term homosexual and heterosexual was first in print. And it was written in a letter, and it was trying to stop some homophobic laws that were being put into use. So this show, before 1868, your sexual desire was what you did. After that, if you take it, it's what you were. It labeled you. So now we're talking queer. So before we had queer, we had artists like Henry Scott Tuke, but John Singer Sargent, who probably everybody knows about. It's clear that he was tended towards a gay lifestyle, just totally by what he painted and everything. And so here we have, say, he had a one of his models, say a nude of a Nicole now, and there it is, and it's so homoerotic. So is this, as we're talking about, is this gay art? Or at the time, what would you call it? It was really fluid then, but it had no term. But it sure would be homoerotic now. And that would be queer art. But
is the statue of David or Venus queer art?
Yeah, well, of course, then that's something else. That supposedly David comes from the Bible. How could it possibly be queer art in the Bible?
I suppose it depends on the artist. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's see. So, what is it like to be a queer artist in the Berkshires, or for that matter, just queer in the Berkshires? What is your experience?
I moved out here peak COVID, left Boston, where I'd spent my entire life, and in the Boston area, where it's pretty easy to find queer community. And one of the things that I was concerned about coming out here is that may not be the case. And I've been really pleasantly surprised that there's a small but mighty queer community here. And I think it's just about showing up to that community and showing up for that community in spaces like these, and making oneself known despite whatever fear might be there. I was really pleased, for example, despite the pouring rain at Berkshire Pride last weekend, that community came out, and we need each other more than ever right now.
Where was the pride held?
In Pittsfield.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah, it was great.
And this Saturday it's going to be in Lee. More rain.
The inaugural,
rain.
yeah, but be there.
In the Berkshires originally, so I grew up in Georgia, not at all like the Berkshires, South Georgia, in the swamp. School, college, touring the country, lived in Boston 26 years. I've only been out here 2.5, 3 years now. And being queer in the Berkshires is the question. How has the
like being queer in the Berkshires, or queer artists in the Berkshires, or whatever combination of that you feel like answering?
I know last year the colors of the leaves, and I made a beautiful piece that I sold almost immediately, one of my quilts. But finding that community, it's here, and being a shy kind of introvert kind of guy, you really have to make yourself reach out. I think it's here. It's small but mighty, but I find myself too often sitting in the corner and waiting to be tapped, which is really not the way to operate. So I'm just warming up to the Berkshires after 3 years here, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think sort of what it means to be queer in the Berkshires, or what it means to sort of live in the Berkshires in general, is something that I sort of was thinking about throughout my work, and that's what I focus sort of my last sort of body of work on was just like, what does it mean to be a person living in the Berkshires? And I focused it on like different parts of my experiences of living here and the town and the small town aspect. So I'm from New York City. It's very different. And just sort of what that has come to mean to me. And then I was like trying to figure out what to focus my next work on. I was sitting at work at my desk, and I was just like looking through photographs, and these photographs from queer balls that I'd been to, and it was all these people interacting, and I was also thinking about sort of like what was going on politically and people being silenced and shut down and fear, and I was like, there's a space for this part of the queer experience that exists living in the Berkshires. So I started painting, and I'm very slowly in the middle of painting this body of work about exactly that question, sort of what does it mean, and trying to answer it, which I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, I think there's like, it's small, and you go to different events and you see the same people at different events, or same drag performers at different events, whereas like going to a bar in New York City, you know, you might not know anybody, it's more anonymous. And remembering when I was dating, trying to find people, I was like, where is everybody? Where do you find other young queer people? So it's definitely a certain type of scene, and I'm definitely still trying to figure out what it means.
And there's certainly a stillness and a quiet in the Berkshires that I think causes artists to really go into themselves. I mean, there's stillness and quiet. This is all you've got. So what's in there? For me.
Yeah. I'm married. I have a husband. I love it. But we have a circle of friends, and you're right about that. Art is a lonely effort, and I prefer it when there's someone else in the room and I'm painting him or her, and that's just great, and that's why I like to paint people as well.
So next question is really two questions actually. So how have your experiences affected your work? And how has your work evolved?
Experiences in life or experiences in the Berkshires?
Your experiences in life.
For me, creating art has always been a really liberatory practice, and also a practice in not just self-expression, but giving voice to something that words often can't do. I've had a lot of unusual experiences, I guess. I became a parent at 20. I raised a child by myself, became an art teacher, and throughout all of those experiences, I found myself returning to the canvas and to collage, and it's always been, for me, almost like breathing. There are times in my day, especially if I'm feeling stressed, where I just crave holding a tool, a pencil or a paintbrush or something, because it's just such second nature, and it feels like such a cathartic way of processing whatever situation I'm in the middle of. And I see those experiences reflected in my work. I did a series when I was in college that was based on single mothers and their experiences. And as far as how my work has evolved, I think I've always been most interested in the female figure in an abstracted environment. And that has evolved as far as how I use color, how I use the background, my use of composition, but that one thread has remained a constant throughout my career.
I thought this was going to be a difficult question, but then all of a sudden I thought about, I guess I put my life into my paintings. Whoever I'm living with, or I mean, I've had long-term relationships that in between, if they break up, I put that person into my art all the time. And one of the times, it's my painting downstairs, one they're called The Apprentice. That painting is totally a result of my life. This young man was introduced to me. Not only was he coming out as a gay young man, he was coming out as an artist. And a dinner was arranged and set up. And we met, and just like that, it was incredible. He was like late 20s, and I didn't have a boyfriend or anything at the time, not lovers. Anyway, so the painting downstairs, he's sitting at a table, and he's going through all these, it's like this, and he's going through all these books, and he's actually reading a visual history of homosexuality, which you cannot see on there. But there's paintings, there's books on Caravaggio, Paul Cadmus. There's a magazine there where one of my works is on the cover of it, and in back of the painting, I'm sitting at the couch just with on this love seat with my palette. And in back of me, there's this big painting, and the frame goes from my head right into his ears. I mean, these symbol allegories or, symbolic things, but that's all a result of the relationship as a tutor to this young man in two very important ways, artistically and as a mentor, as an older gay mentor.
Yeah, I think my life is always there in my work. Thinking back to the first time that I sort of painted with more serious intent was in college, and sort of large-scale oil paintings about. I had written this creative story about like a satirical twist on a fantasy world, but it was about growing up and like coming of age and what sort of like different phases I had gone through, and so that was the first work, and that was sort of grappling with a certain part of my life, and I think throughout as I've created different bodies of work since then, that's always been ongoing, sort of like what I'm going through, different people, places, questions that I have, attempts to answer questions, but it's always I think reflective of my sort of like inner world and how that meets the outer world. I think my work has technically grown a bit since I started. I was looking at old paintings, but that's always still work in progress. But I think for me, like when I learned how to break down images into an underpainting even before working into color, just being able to break things down into form and tone was big for me. Or even when I learned how to like grid up a photograph, because that really helped me get perspective and proportions down. So I think there's just been like little things along the way that I'll, sort of visual vocabulary, and then that'll sort of come into my vocabulary as I'm painting. So it's an ever-growing process. I think there's also been a lot of periods where I could not paint, where I was totally blocked, and the difficulties with that, or when I thought, I don't really need to do this anymore, I'm going to give it up, or when it's all I want to do and I don't want to go to work or do anything else. So, large array of different experiences with painting.
I feel like my work, the experience is kind of combining how has it grown plus how experience has driven the work or helped create the work. It's hard to compare, I think, what painters are doing to quilt making, but oftentimes I I get a response from someone, oh, my grandma makes quilts, or oh, blah, blah, and to diminish what product is there, which is fine. I have responses for people, but the next quilt that I make after that conversation, those points are a little better, the fluff is a little fluffier, the greens are a little greener. Things grow from those criticisms, and because I'm labeling quilt making as an artwork, I find myself having to find ways to create those depths you're talking about, and making quilts, which is flat or on the bed or on the wall, wherever you put them, on the ceiling, look like something you can reach into. And in the beginning, it was just sewing 4 squares together. Oh, there's a quilt. Not so much.
My God, no, it's incredible the way you see his quilt downstairs. I can't believe it.
It's the peacock.
Yeah, and you just made me think of something I kind of want to ask the rest of you, which is, as an artist, you're putting your work on display. Inevitably, you're going to run into criticism along the way. How does that affect you, and how do you respond to it?
I felt so bad when you said somebody goes up and, oh, my grandmother made quilts. It's like an artist, and when I do it, and somebody comes up, oh, it looks just like a photograph. And that person that comes up to you probably didn't mean any way except, oh, my grandma, because they don't know anything. They're speechless. They just don't know what to say. I forgot the question, but that's what I was saying.
About
criticism, right.
critique,
But that response usually comes to me from a person who says, oh, this is what I would like, blah, 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 blah. Could I talk you into doing that for me, with me? Let's work on it together.
Sure.
How much would that be?
That's very important.
And I go, and I slide it over, and they go, oh, well, my grandma used to do this. I'll see if she can do it.
Right. How much is your
Be
grandma?
like, well, maybe go ask your grandma.
Go ask your grandma to do it. Yeah. Picking the right color, all the time. It's work. Stop it. So to answer that question, for me, criticism, it's either constructive or it's not, for me. And if it's not, I work hard to dismiss it, but man, does it just eat you up sometimes when, doesn't it?
Sometimes.
It does.
It's like reading the comments.
It's very sticky. Yeah.
Reading the comments on social media, I just say, no, don't read them. Don't read them.
Yeah. It depends who says them, too.
Right.
There's a lot of jealousy out there, I've found out. Other quilt makers, maybe, or people who have tried it and just don't say it.
Well, I think that's an important distinction, too. The distinction between critique and criticism, and who it's coming from. Part of in college, part of the process was critique, and you were critiqued not just by your professors but your peers. People could be ruthless, and the goal was for you to improve. It feels different coming from a viewer who hasn't seen your process, who hasn't been, sitting at the easel next to you, like also putting their blood, sweat, and tears into whatever they're creating. So yeah, it's definitely has a sticky quality to it. For me, like I still remember a solo show I did a couple years back, and I got a lot of great comments and really, wonderful feedback, but there was one thing, and it was not meant negatively at all, but it was sort of a misinterpretation, and I still remember that. And yeah, it's hard, but I think for me, the way I try to deal with it is to remember that primarily I make art for myself, and if it speaks to the right person, great, and if it doesn't, it wasn't really meant for them, and that's okay. We weren't meant to have that conversation.
Right. Bravo.
No, it doesn't always work though. I try, but it doesn't always work.
I guess criticism comes in different shapes and forms. I think some criticism is good, and then some encouragement is good. I can't remember the last time. I think it's just more like my own comparisons to other people, and sort of wow, and then just trying to accept what type of artist I am, and where I'll sort of fit, and what my strengths are and what they aren't, and what's possible and what's not possible, as opposed to things people have said. I mean, people say things, but yeah, that's more just my own sort of what I think is possible with my work and what I've made, and yeah, just trying not to compare too much or think about what sort of success I want with it. Yeah, it's a good question. Is it for other people? Is it for me? What's the goal? Yeah.
And the flip side to that is, I mean, we hear criticism. At the same time, it's equally, I think, hard sometimes dealing with a glowing praise or a compliment, depending on where it's coming from. You know, if a true artist says to you, you know, I appreciate A, B, C, and D, and you hear all the right words they're saying, and you go, okay. You just weep. You just weep.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So I think they're both hard. Criticism and praise. How do you?
Pardon me, having some allergy issues. So let's see here. So here's a question. Are you a full-time artist, or do you have a day job? And what is that? What is the balance?
I am not a full-time artist. Actually, Rachel and I were having a conversation about this the other night, and the push and pull of, do you want to be a full-time artist or not? And, so I'm not. I never have been. I've always also taught. I'm a licensed pre-K to 8 visual art teacher, and I'm currently, right now I work at Pittsfield High School. And I don't know if I could be a full-time artist. I think as much as I love being in the studio, you know, we were talking earlier about how you can get into your own head and how that's really necessary for the process, but it can also be very isolating. And I think being out in the community and working with young people is really integral to my process as an artist.
And does it have a dental plan?
Just and it has a dental plan.
I if anything in the world good came out of COVID, it was that I will never work in a cubicle again. So for the last 20 plus years, I've worked in finances in the corporate world, and kind of COVID is what brought us out to the Berkshires. And even though the offices are open back up, we can still do it remotely. So I am not a full-time artist, is to answer that question. But yeah, while I'm dealing with spreadsheets and meetings in and out, Zoom meetings, right over there, 5 feet away, 10 feet away is all my work, and so I'm full-time over here as well as right here, because I have a dental plan.
Yeah.
in the corporate world.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is a question I've been grappling with a lot lately. So when I finished college, I think I was kind of too young to figure out what you want to do. My professors actually did encourage me to get an MFA, and I decided to get an art teaching degree instead. And for a lot of reasons, I was struggling with myself and didn't really pursue teaching art that much. Right now I've been working at a family resource center, just doing admin work, and I am going to I have a teaching job that I'm going to start in 2 weeks, but it's not teaching art, it's just general education, just sort of teaching kids who are struggling in the school system, to help them get back on track, which psychology is also very important to me, but I have lately been going back to sort of thinking about the encouragement towards getting an MFA and wanting it more and wanting to be painting more, so I don't know. That's the answer to that question.
I'm a full-time artist. It's my only income. I wasn't always. When I was graduated from high school, during high school I played the piano for 3 hours a day, and I also painted 3 hours a day. And I chose music. And 15 years later, I was a pianist, and I came down with Meniere's disease. And so you have those horrible, vertigo and falling on the floor and everything. And I went to 6 specialists, and one of them said, you may go deaf. And I said, that's not going to happen. I mean, I got to change my life. So I gave myself 2 years. And so what I started to do, I was a piano teacher also, and so I had the income, and I could I started painting, drawing and painting. For 2 years, all I did was draw and do watercolors for 2 years. And I followed this course by Nicole from the Art Students League. I was able to get with a friend in my small town. I had a nude model 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, and draw it from. And after 2 years, I just didn't have any piano. I just painted. That's all I did. And the best advice I ever had was from another painter who was sort of mentoring me. He says, you can't do this part-time. If you want to be a painter full-time, you have to just simply do it. And I was very fortunate, and I did it. And my dental plan is that I got this new young dentist about 15 years ago, and he had his first child, and he goes, oh, wow, you're a painter? So I have lifetime dental insurance because I painted a full portrait of each of his 3 daughters now. Bartering.
Do it.
I'm serious.
Very creative dental plan.
A friend does my taxes because I made a king-size quilt for him. And I know the bartering thing.
Yeah. I've never done my own taxes. Oh, God.
Well, thank you all for that. Those are the formal questions. Are there any questions that the audience would like to ask?
I actually have one. And I have a little preface to this question. I reference this. Jacob's Pillow was founded by Wallace Shawn, and it got its first kind of claim to fame by the male dancers that went around the country. And he was not out. He was married to a woman. And we subsequently have claimed him as a queer artist. And when we look at the Clark Art Institute, the grandfather of the Clark dynasty had a male lover in Norway who he spent the entire summer every year with, and who had an apartment down the street from the Clark dynasty's kind of big house in New York City. And he had an apartment that everybody knew about, where he lived when he was in the U.S. And their relationship went on for 40 years. And when he died, the Clarks, commissioned a sculpture that's still at the Clark Art Institute called Brotherhood. And it was for his grave in Norway, and it's still there, the original. The copy is at the Clark. So Edith Wharton hung out with lots of queer men and lots of lesbians throughout her life, especially in Paris. And we subsequently have kind of claimed her as an important figure in queer art. And she knew all the poets, all the painters. She was a patron / best friend of. And when you go through every, Tanglewood, Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, the list is very long of people that we now claim as queer artists. They didn't claim that when they were alive necessarily, but certainly we, looking back, kind of have claimed them. So my question is, what do you think about this process of claiming queer artists and claiming queer art? And it's like, what do you think about that process as artists? And here we are, kind of creating a queer space and making space for queer art and queer artists. But and I've got from people's earlier answers, it's a little uncomfortable. So just more about like, what's the process for you been like, and what do you think about this process of claiming our history, claiming our artists, claiming our art?
It's a really good question. I sort of love the idea of like reaching back through time and bringing artists and musicians and playwrights and poets who maybe were not able to come out, who it was not safe at that time, or perhaps were not out to themselves, and sort of bringing them into the current space and holding space for them in the here and now. I think, when I was in high school, I was in a fairly progressive area, and it still was scary for people to come out. And so I think, especially in the political climate that we're in right now, coming out is not always possible. And so to be able to hold space for people who haven't in the past been able to, or even right now are not in a geographical area or, within their family, that it would be safe to come out, to hold space for people in that position as well. And I think by creating intentional spaces like this one, we can do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very important. I think it's very important that queer art and queer artists be recognized. But this is the first time I've really presented my work as like queer work in terms of presenting my art, and it does make me a little nervous. Just the one thing I was thinking about, sort of in terms of like the idea of like gatekeeping in the queer community, and I was thinking about like musicians, and the musical artist Fletcher's like been a lesbian her whole life. Now she's dating a man, and actually like the sort of like reverse coming out process being really difficult, and what does that mean? So it's definitely tricky to label yourself in this niche, because it is like an evolving sort of human process.
Reaching back and bringing forth of the sexuality and the queerness of past artists, visual, music, poets, writers, authors in general, is necessary to create, I believe, a forward motion for young people, because it just happens to be, in the case of John Singer Sargent and Henry Scott Tuke, who were contemporaries, they both had sisters who never married and who went through their letters and destroyed them. I think Leonard Bernstein, was never out. Quote, out. Everybody knew he was out. I mean, anybody in the field of the arts knew he was out. But I think, wait a minute, I lost something I was holding on to because I'm trying to think of the process of doing it and why it's important. What this show in Chicago is doing right now, with words we have a very limited vocabulary, but visually we have an unending ways of expressing. We can say homosexual, heterosexual. We can say binary, non-binary, demi-binary, trans, and we can use all these words, but they are all limited. Visually, they're not. And all these words that we're using now and what's happening, especially to young people, were sort of felt throughout time. I think civilizations had this. I mean, especially in Africa and in India, they had this freedom of these. There were people who were born male and immediately put in female roles. But then colonialism happened, right? And so all of a sudden these homophobic laws were put, and these people were just going, oh my God, and the way my whole history was, it happened. So now, what this show in Chicago does, there's 300 paintings there, over 300 paintings, with 125 gay artists, or quote gay artists, right? You know, we're all putting all those labels on, and it's just magnificent. You can just see. I mean, where are we? Everything is so fluid. There are so many colors of value, of black to white, of gray, and that's the process, and that's what's necessary to bring out, I think, and why, and to move forward, to make people aware of that. Sort of.
I love that idea, though, that language, it's imperfect, right? And it doesn't always express the breadth of the human experience, especially with regards to gender and sexuality, but that visual art can perhaps capture some element of it that a word can't.
Yeah.
I really like that idea.
Yeah. Yours downstairs, that photo, that's the word I was thinking, is marvelous, that woman there, just, you can't describe that in words.
When I first got out of college, I went from South Georgia to Chicago. I am a trained dancer, and so I'm going to dance, and I'm going to take improv classes, and I'm going to be the next, whatever that is. And of course, theater, acting, improv, dance is all just full of rejection. So at some point I started stage managing, and then just started working all the time. And one of the first just out and out gay, it was the Gay Theater Pride Festival. And so I'm like, okay, I'll go be a stage manager there. And it was all gay and lesbian artists creating theater, for the whole month of June and July. And it became Chicago's biggest festival for 6 or 7 years running. So to say, and we would, part of the process is taking a Shakespeare play and doing all male version or an all female version. 40 years ago, what? Shakespeare was not a queer artist, and we're not going to claim him ever, I don't think, are we? I mean, he did play with gender. He did, so claiming artists as queer, I don't, again, labeling. I'm proud to be a queer artist, but hate to be labeled a queer artist. I just...
Yeah, cool.
Because the people in Hazelhurst, Georgia, near my hometown, they're not going to buy queer art. They're not, because their bakeries won't sell to gay weddings. So, I don't know. That's just me pondering. I could ponder that forever. Thank you for that.
I'd like to add something on that thought. This show in Chicago, it's so earth-shaking. There was an interview with Jonathan D. Katz, who's the curator of it. And one of the questions was, is this show going to move to another venue besides Chicago? And he said, we're talking with 2 places in Europe. And he says, what about this country? He said, "Oh no one will touch it. Not one museum will touch it, and we've offered it free of charge." 85% of the paintings that they wanted, and they the museums would not loan them for this show, or the galleries, or the private collections.
Not even San Francisco.
It was incredible. It was stunning. Anyway, any of you, I'm just flying there next week. I have this show. Please go. It's selling out like crazy. But yeah, I said that only because you were saying who's going to not buy your art and stuff. But people only want to show it.
All right. Any more questions? Thank you. Yes.
First comment that my partner studied under Jonathan at University of Buffalo and thinks of him as a mentor, and it was because of him he was able to get into what ended up being not the best master's degree program at Williams, but went there. But first I want to thank you for sharing your experience and for touching upon history and historical figures, and it made me think to ask this question. You know, we think about modern gay or queer. I'm old enough that I'm gay. My partner's young enough that he's queer. But think about more modern or more recent history. Stonewall, Harvey Milk, losing a ship named after Harvey Milk. What else? AIDS. Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Gays in the military. Transgender and transphobia now. I'm wondering, do any of this modern history, which isn't maybe super positive, does any of that inform what you do? Just curious.
I'm a huge fan of Anita Bryant because no other figure in the world galvanized in the U.S. galvanized. Sometimes I just get emotional. But you know, to fight and galvanize, you know, to get strong, there's got to be something to fight. And she gave a huge community something to fight, come together for. So, and growing up as a kid, you know, Anita Bryant was Miss Something, and you know, as a kid, we watched Miss America and all the beauty pageants, and she was on the commercials, so she was a little, in South Georgia, a little hero, and now she's a different kind of hero for me, you know, and it was a fun conversation to have with a mom who still struggles at times with, you know, who I am and how I grow. Not really, but in my heart of hearts, she does. So to have that conversation, to say, yeah, I love Anita Bryant, and this is why. You know, not because she's saying how great thou art, but because she caused a lot of people to come together and fight.
You were talking about something a little bit more modern than that. Are you talking basically like for the past 6 months, kind of like?
Well, sure. Last 60 years or last 6 months.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, does any of this cloud, does it come into your work, or do you think about community or introspection or past experience, and it's really not so much part of what you're doing?
For me, I want to address that because I don't know yet. I mean, I'm thinking about that. That's for sure, because I want to do more narrative painting for sure. But there's a guy, I can't believe his name is escaping me, whose work I adore in England, who already, when in the first president number 45, when he took presidency, he started doing these incredible, you know, paintings about him, and it was very, very narrative and very informative. And I don't know if I'd be that obvious about it, but this guy, what's his name? But yeah, I don't know anybody who's doing that yet, but I really don't know what's happening on the scene either. I am tend to see it to be, but I'm going to make a point of trying to do some paintings and express what the fuck is happening right now. And that's exactly how we all feel, I
You
think.
said sometimes the words aren't right, but the art might say it all.
I'm sorry?
You had said earlier the words aren't always precise and don't always
Yes.
clearly communicate, but the work does.
Yes.
So maybe.
Yes. Yes. That can. Yes.
I kind of, want to step out of my chair for a moment and kind of touch on something that you're mentioning in your question. You kind of talking about with an exhibit, and museums not touching an exhibit because it featured a queer artist. Right?
Yeah.
So I have a friend who, and I won't mention names but he was curating a major exhibit down in D.C. It was supposed to open in March, I think, but it featured queer artists of color. Essentially, was the big thing. But because of current directives, anything which mentions the word gay or anything LGBTQ related, or anything that really covers a person of color of any sort, exhibits that are in museums that are receiving any federal dollars are basically being canceled because the museums are terrified of losing their money.
Yeah.
And that may be, public museums that are literally part of our government, but also private museums that are receiving grant funding. So it's a major concern, and for museums to figure out how they're going to make up that money if they decide to be brave and take on the show as well. So it's a real conundrum. And some museums are still trying to do the work, and others are trying to figure out how to do it in a way that they can be more clever about it. But as soon as it becomes a question of, well, if it features a gay artist, even though you're not specifically talking about any subject, it suddenly becomes, well, now that's forbidden. It's verboten, right? Like that's like a huge issue, and it's about silence.
I think fascism has always recognized that art is a threat to its existence, and during the lead up to World War II, there was a degenerate art show that was curated by the Nazis, and art that was considered a threat to the empire was hung on the walls, and people came in and looked at it, and that to me has always stood out as sort of a call to artists to recognize our own power in dismantling systems of oppression, especially as they're gaining power right now. So I really appreciate that question. I think it's making art as a revolutionary act. It can be a revolutionary act, or it can be an act of acquiescing to fascism, and we have to choose.
I don't want to change the subject. I want to broaden it just for a second. It's not just art. It's DEI. It's diversity, equality, and inclusion. And what we have now in this administration is proposing in the Department of Education and Cultural Affairs, the budget currently is $691 million a year, and what's his name used to be employed, Matt Rubio, it's cutting it down to $50 million. And because of this, yesterday every member of the Fulbright board, the Fulbright Commission Scholarship, every single member, 12 members resigned. It doesn't exist anymore. And 300, I think, scholarships already have been revoked. And that was an international exchange of scholarship, of course. And the arts. It's not just scholarship. Why is there any difference in scholarship and the arts? I don't know. We could like it. You can't be smart if you're a painter, right? Yeah. But anyway, okay, now let's focus back again. I just get very worked up about things like that.
It's important.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback. NEA recently canceled $27 million worth of grants that they had already made because there was violations of DEI in those. So they just went through and said, yeah, we said we're going to give you that money. We're not. $27 million erased because there was diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's shocking. What is happening right now is shocking. It's like, and arts organizations all over the country who were counting on that money, had already spent part of that money, are now being told, nope, you don't get that money. Yeah. And they're suing, of course, But it's worth saying, for artists, this is a really scary time. Like, all those artists, that 27 million, that's their bread and butter. That's how they pay their rent. And they're not going to be able to. Because somebody said, we don't like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Anyway, so I just had to kind of pipe in.
Yeah. It's called the Heritage Foundation Project 2025.
Yeah.
That's what it is. You know.
Do we have any other questions?
I'm a librarian and a student of gay writers. I have been most of my life, going back to when I was 13 or 14, reading Walt Whitman, really startling by Walt Whitman, writing, loving Walt Whitman, and other writers, Clifford, I can't think, I'm 85 years old, I can't remember her name. I met Gerald Malenga. He was I was in residence at Simon's Rock College and lived 1 block away from me. And he did photography and poetry. I don't know if you remember him. He was Andy Warhol's sidekick in the last few years, many years ago. So, there's all kinds of writers who had to face those challenges. Tennessee Williams, Stephen Spender, David Hockney. All these people had to suffer the consequences of being gay in America and being persecuted, for it. Time Magazine, everywhere else, Gore Vidal. I don't know how many people have read much Gore Vidal, but if you read his essays, you see where he had come from to write these wonderful historical novels he did. So these are all these people that made my life more enriched. We talked about Edith Wharton. Henry James was one of her best friends, and Henry James was gay. So there's all kinds of underground currents, and also all kinds of wonderful writers and thinkers. And Edie Sedgwick was a neighbor of mine, and her sister, Alice Bowl, wrote a book about her sister, how she was kind of persecuted and probably taken advantage of by Andy Warhol, Edie Sedgwick. And Joe D'Alessandro in his movies, Trash. I remember all those movies Andy Warhol made? They're remarkable.
Yeah, and that was local here, basically in the Berkshires. That this was. Yes. That's something. Yeah. Wow.
Well, it is.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes.
So this actually, I'm here as a co-sponsor of Berkshire Queer History Project, but this question comes more from my work with Berkshire Stone Wall. And I noticed that most of you have mentioned, moving either short distances or long distances to either present or do your work here in the Berkshires. And I'm wondering, what was the series of choices that brought you here to the Berkshires, whether it be moving a great distance or being just somewhere where, within the state that this made more sense in the end. And that includes the artistic communities, what you had there compared to here.
For me, it was a very bizarre confluence of life circumstances, some expected, some unexpected. My son graduated from high school. I got divorced. I stepped back from classroom teaching full time. I started traveling across the country, and then COVID hit. So all of that happened within a 6 to 8 month period, and I was sort of flailing around looking for some sense of home and some sense of gravity, I guess. I felt like I was sort of floating in the ether, and I knew that this was I've always been drawn to nature and to being outside. I love to hike, and art obviously is my passion, so I knew that this was an area where both of those things were sort of woven into the fabric of the community. And it's ended up being, I came out here 2020 and I haven't looked back. I go back to Boston to visit, but it was sort of I thought a short-term experiment, and it's ended up being my home.
Hey.
I just ended up here, luckily, happily, accidentally, all of those words apply. Moving from point A to point B about 20 different times throughout my life. Was in Boston for 20 years, and my partner and I were actually getting ready to move or buy a house in Wisconsin, of all places in the world. And friends of ours out here who have a big, beautiful house in Lee decided to move to Nantucket because they both got jobs there, but they didn't want to sell their house. And my partner, we had already discussed, we're ready to make this big move to Wisconsin looking for property. He said, I really don't want to leave Massachusetts. I said, what? And so my friends just said, why don't we do this? So they're on Nantucket. We're in their house for the next X years. ... To be continued.
For me, it was just people who I knew and stuff related to mental health, and I think I've stayed because I do kind of like the small town atmosphere of the Berkshires, and the art community up here is interesting. I mean, I'm just still getting to know it more and more. It's my first time here at the Becket Art Center, and I'm familiar with the Berkshire Art Center, the Berkshire Artist Guild, and the Berkshire Artists is in a show with them in Lenox, and it's just really cool. There's a lot going on, and you'll see the same people over and over again, which is nice community. So there is a lot that I do like about it.
I was a student in college, as a piano student at Mannes College of Music in New York City, and ever since a kid, we had a place in Chesterfield, like Lake Damon, and we also had a place near Bennington, and I mean separately, my grandparents, and I just knew I always wanted to live up in the country, and I didn't like practicing 6 hours of piano a day when I was in college, so I quit college, and I simply moved up here. And I wanted a life. I had no concept. I was young. I had no concept of career or anything. I just knew I wanted to do what I wanted to do. I mean, not foolishly, I hoped, but I did it and I lucked out.
I do sometimes kind of miss you called it earlier, anonymity of New York.
There is not anonymity here, for sure.
And you can always visit New York.
And I'm so bad with names, and somebody says, "Oh, Mitchell," and I just freeze. Thank you.